if any of you fall asleep over the next 20 minutes, blame the acoustics as much as the content if you can. The acoustics are not great in this room, I know. Look, I want to start where Mike did, back in 1790. Arguably, the most important things ever happened in human history happened in the 1790s in Manchester. I don't know if anyone's read The Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert. Give me just a quote from that book. What Silicon Valley was to the semiconductor, Manchester was to cotton production and steam power, an incubating cluster at the center of a global network of capital and ideas. And that was in the 1790s. And between 1790 and 1820, the productivity involved in producing cotton textiles went up by 390 times. By 1820, cotton was 22.5% of the UK's GMP. Now that was an extraordinary revolution that happened here in Manchester. Disraeli, writing in his novel Coningsby in 1844, before he became Prime Minister, said that Manchester is as great a human exploit as Athens or Rome. And that was the extent of the achievement in Manchester at the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And we stand here now, arguably at the end of 3.0, on the verge, on the threshold of 4.0. And if the UK was absolutely at the forefront of the first Industrial Revolution, it was sort of in the pack in the Second Revolution, along with Germany and the US. Unquestionably, the Third Industrial Revolution was won by the Americans. If we look at companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, there is no question that the US have dominated that phase of industrial development. Only China, I think, can offer any pretense at having an answer to the extraordinary progress the Americans have made since sort of between the 1970s and today. So we stand here today as we move into 4.0, where artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, where machines are now going to be not just replacing manual skills, but cognitive skills as well. And I don't know whether you've read The Second Machine Age by two MIT professors in the US, when they say in that digital technologies are doing for human brain power what the steam engine did for muscle power during the Industrial Revolution, which I think sums it up pretty well. So we are then putting together our industrial strategy at a time of huge opportunity as we go forward into 4.0. But there's also some background as well. The background is, I think, twofold. Firstly, that the UK has very poor levels of productivity. We are probably between 20 and 30% less productive than our competitor economies in Europe and the US. And the second is that we have probably the most unequal society of any in Europe, because so much of our wealth is concentrated in London and the southeast. And that inequality is being exacerbated by the hollowing out that is happening as a result of these new technologies that I talked about earlier on, what is described as the great uncoupling, where in the past productivity increases has raised the tide for everybody. It now looks as though these new technologies are raising the tide for some, but not everybody. I mean, interestingly, 2/3 of the growth in national income in the USA since 2002, 2/3 of all that growth has gone to 1% of the population. The top 0.01% in the USA, now their share of national income since 1995 has grown from 3% to 6%. So we are seeing in the UK not just low productivity, but also growing inequality. And if you want a reason for why Donald Trump won the presidential election, and many of the underlying reasons for Brexit, I think you need look no further than that huge swathes of society feel that they've been forgotten about and left behind. And when you look at the income statistics, that is indeed the case. So we move on then to our industrial strategy. And I think there's a number of general points I should make. The first is, someone put it to me the other day about the UK, is that we are incorrigibly incrementalist. I read a speech by one of the vice presidents of Google last week. It's called the 10x strategy. And their argument is that you should seek to multiply your business by 10 times, not just in incremental chunks like 2 times. So I think we need a big response from our strategy, not an incremental one. Second, they've always been short-term. Because our political cycle is short-term, so our industrial strategies have been short-term. We need an industrial strategy that has the buy-in across parties, across politics, and is here not for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but for 10 to 20 years. Thirdly, I think our strategies in the past have been based around incumbency. We've tended to support the big, large employers who are there today, when in fact many of the companies that we want to support have not even been thought about yet. I thought an interesting figure here is that if you take the Fortune 500 companies, in 1950, the average length of time that a company was in the Fortune 500 was 60 years. By 1980, it had fallen to 25 years. By 2012, it's 18 years, and it's coming down rapidly. I've read in the paper this morning that Tesla now have a market cap in excess of Ford. Uber have a greater market cap, a greater enterprise value than Ford and GM combined. We're looking at a massive change in the corporate sector. So our strategy must not be based just around incumbencies. Then I think the final sort of general theme that should run through our industrial strategy is that we must have a competitive fiscal environment. We must have a low-tax economy. Interestingly, in 2010, corporation tax was 28%. By 2020, it will be down to 17%. Turning, if I can, to the specifics of our industrial strategy, and I think there are four aspects of it that I'd just like to mention today. Firstly, of course, skills. I mean, whoever you talk to, whatever industry you talk to, skills is top of the agenda. And I think it falls into two. Firstly, we need to teach children at primary school and secondary school to be creative, to think, to problem solve. As it's been put to me, if we're going much further into a machine learning age and a robotic age, we need creativity from our people. But probably more important, certainly more important over the next 10 years or 20 years, is that we must reform technical education in the UK. There are currently 13,000 different technical qualifications for 16 to 18-year-olds. It is over-complex and fails to provide the skills that we need for the 21st century. In 2013-14, this is an incredible statistic, I think, 9,000 women did a level 2 apprenticeship in hairdressing. 80 did a level 2 apprenticeship in engineering. I mean, that's a dreadful statistic. But it exaggerates to make a point. But nevertheless, there's this huge waste of resource in our economy, looking at it purely in economic terms, that so few women go into manufacturing and engineering and computer sciences. This was a point made in the report that came out last week by Tech Nation as well, that in the digital world, the tech world, there is still a huge imbalance of male to female. Technical education in our country for the last 50 years has been very much the poor relation of academic education, and that has to change. So skills are going to be, I think, will be absolutely central to our strategy going forward. Secondly, research. We have arguably 4 of the finest universities in the world in this country. Within Europe, we have 6 of the top 7 universities based in the UK. One, of course, is here in Manchester. We produce fantastic research, and we must carry on producing fantastic research. But how well do we commercialize some of the intellectual property that comes out of our universities? And it's how we commercialize that through Innovate UK, for example, who are here today, is hugely important. And I should say in the context of research that you can only do world-class research if you have world-class people. About 30% of all our primary investigators at the Crick Institute, for example, are EU nationals or overseas nationals. We have to remain open to overseas people to come here to do research and to do technical skills. And I just quote this because there is some misapprehension about this. This is Theresa May when she says, "I want us to be a secure, prosperous, tolerant country, a magnet for international talent." You know, David Davis, the Secretary of State for Brexit, says, "If we are to win in the global marketplace, we must win the global battle for talent." So we should be in no doubt at all that we need to have an immigration policy that allows us to attract the best in the world into this country. It's interesting as well in the budget that the government set aside £250 million specifically to attract overseas talent. £90 million to fund 1,000 PhDs in STEM subjects, and £100 million to attract top researchers from around the world. The third aspect of our strategy going forward I'd like to mention is place. You know, we have been too London-centric for too long. For most of the 19th century, London was the political centre, but the north was the economic powerhouse. And we have to put more, we have to decentralize more power, more resources, more control over things like infrastructure and education back to local people. And that will, I think, be a core part of our strategy. The last part of the strategy I would like to mention today is the consequences of change. If Andy Haldane, in his speech, who's the chief economist of the Bank of England, gave a prediction that the 4.0 industrial revolution could mean the end of 18 million existing jobs in the UK, 80 million jobs in the US. It could be that profound. That is disruption of a very high degree. And if we don't cope with that disruption, we don't cope with the social consequences of that disruption, then it will be extremely difficult socially. I used to work at British Steel in the 1980s, and I went back to Redcar last week. Redcar used to employ 15,000 steel workers, and just over the river at Wilton, ICI used to employ, at its peak, 30,000 people at the Wilton petrochemical plant. That was 45,000 people earning decent wages. There are now in that combined site 5,000 people. And you have to ask yourself, what happened to those other 35,000 people? And if we don't have an answer, if we don't have a social answer for that going forwards, then not only will it make it much more difficult to implement these new, highly productive, disruptive technologies, but it will lead to an increasingly unequal and unstable society. I referred to 2 professors at MIT who wrote this paper called The Second Machine Age. I'll just end with a quote from one of them. Our one confident prediction is that digital technologies will bring the world into an era of more wealth and abundance and less drudgery and toil. But there's no guarantee that everyone will share in the bounty, and that leaves many people justifiably apprehensive. The outcome, shared prosperity or increasing inequality, will be determined not by technologies, but by the choices we make as individuals, organizations, and societies. If we fumble that future, If we build economies and societies that exclude many people from the cycle of prosperity, shame on us. Technological progress is an extraordinarily powerful force, but it's not destiny. It won't lift us into utopia or carry us into an unwanted future. The power to do that rests with us human beings. Technologies are merely our tools. I think that's a very profound statement. Technologies are only our tools, massively powerful as we develop battery technology, robotics, AI, and the like, hugely genomics, hugely powerful. It gives us powers that we could never have dreamt of in the past. But we have to use those powers with great care if we are not to create a very unequal, dysfunctional society. Thank you. What would you say?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lord Prior, for an inspiring address. It's good to hear you not only talk about the ambition in the industrial strategy, but also the troubling issue of inequality that lurks in the background. So that's a lot of food for thought. Can you be persuaded to take a couple of questions? Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to use my position on the floor to ask the first question, and then we'll come to the audience. I was sent a question by a group called Stella, which is a group of very senior women from tech. I'm on the group as it happens, and I was really thrilled to hear you talking a bit about diversity in your address. But Stella asked me to ask you that in the industrial strategy, which they very much welcome, they don't see a lot of focus on diversity. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about what you hope in the industrial strategy to do around the diversity and inclusion issue that you described so well.
Well, someone told me the other day that the washing machine was one of the world's great transformative, disruptive technologies because it freed up women from their traditional role in the house to go to work. But if you look at our labour market now, and you look at the tech area, you would think would be an area where women would be fully involved, at least on a 50% basis. Yeah. And I was staggered to read from the Tech Nation report that came out last week that is not the case. And I mean, quite apart from social justice issues, it is a massive waste. And actually, I'm looking around this room today, how many women are here? I don't want to insult anyone, but I can't see more than about 10. I mean, that is quite revealing. So we clearly have a lot to do. And I'd have thought in tech, which is it tends to be young people's business. It is. I'm absolutely staggered that there aren't more women in it. I'm glad you made this point to me today, and I think we should make that point very strongly when we publish our industrial strategy later in the summer. Because in the same way that we can't rely and shouldn't rely upon just London, we shouldn't rely on just men, because actually we are cutting ourselves off from so much resource and so much talent. So I take the point you make, and I've heeded it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Do we have a question in the audience? Okay, we'll just wait for a microphone. And if you could let us know who you are, that would be great.
Hi, Justin Cunningham from Eureka magazine. We're an engineering magazine, trade mag in the UK. I wanted to pick up on some comments you were saying about the long term versus the short term. Companies these days, they're very, very short term in their thinking. Quarterly results are all important. Governments, indeed, every 5 years, they have to ensure they're kept elected so they can carry on with strategies. How do you convince people to buy in for the long term when the tech is changing so quickly, when the impetus to get results is so short term? It's almost like these two forces are pulling against each other. How do you kind of get around that?
Well, I think that there are some capital markets which are very short. The public markets are very short term. Quarterly results are very important. That is true. But actually, if you look at companies, look at the way that Amazon is financed. You know, they haven't made a serious profit yet in Amazon, a serious profit. They've been around for a while now. If you look at the way the biotech industry is financed in California, there is a lot of patient capital out there. And we'll take a 15-year view. It takes 15 years to get from the laboratory into the market for a new pharmaceutical product. And I think we need deeper pools of longer-term patient capital in the UK. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And there are some funds developing over here now, and I think these private funds will be a better source of long-term capital than the public markets, which are, I think, culturally very sort of short-term driven. Although again, you look at Tesla. Tesla's a public company. I mean, people are taking longer-term bets. And I don't know, you take companies like BT, for example. I mean, if they are purely focused on the short term, they will not be in business in 10 years' time. I think there is if the management of these big companies do not take a longer-term strategic view, and even if they are going to have to sacrifice some short-term, more difficult meetings in the city, then they won't be here in 10, 20 years' time, because as you say, technology is changing. And if you don't keep up with technology, you have no business.
Thank you. Is there one last question for Lord Pryor? Okay, over here.
Hello, George Dibb from the All Party Parliamentary Manufacturing Group. You spoke very eloquently about how the sites in Redcar have downsized and fewer people are working there. But now a lot of those employees that maybe were directly employed on the plant floor will be in the logistics or the delivery side that surround the manufacturing sector. And traditionally manufacturing is viewed as 10 to 11% of the economy, but are we systematically underestimating the size of the manufacturing sector because of the changing nature of work and the digitalization of the manufacturing process?
Well, good question. I think, it's interesting, we are around 10% in manufacturing in the UK. Germany is around 17%. Southern Ireland is 23%, interestingly. I mean, we are further along that journey than most. I mean, I think the problem is that those people at Redcar, Lackenby and Wilson were people who will be making £40,000 a year type jobs now. They are skilled jobs in productive industries. Many of those people now are working on £7.20 an hour. And we have a productivity problem in Britain. We don't have an employment problem as such. We have very high levels of employment, at very low wages, in low productivity jobs. I mean, Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, his diagnosis of the problem is that we have this huge, what he calls laggards, which is actually 90% of the economy, who are way off the pace. Our top 10% of our global companies, our frontier companies, can compete with the world. And you go to Toyota or Jaguar Land Rover, their productivity levels are every bit as good as BMW or Volkswagen. But it's that long tail of lower performing companies that we have, where the take-up of technology is very low. And actually, one of the big challenges of our industrial strategy is how do we address that long tail of poorly performing companies? It's a management issue, it's an aspiration issue, it's an access to capital issue, it's an adoption of technology issue. It's a cultural issue. And I don't have there's not an easy answer to this, to be honest with you. How do we get a greater degree of entrepreneurship into the UK? We used to have it here. We got the DNA is here. You've only got to look back at the history of Manchester to see that we have it in our DNA. But somehow we have got to re-invoke that. And of course, we can see it in the digital world. I mean, if you look at the fintech world or the edtech world in London and other parts of the country, or robotics in Bristol, wherever, or AI in Cambridge, we have got this, but we haven't got it yet at sufficient scale.
Thank you very much. So, Lord Pryor, thank you so much for coming up today and for joining some questions as well. I appreciate that. So please join me in thanking Lord Pryor.